Kat may not be able to be with us for the next 3 months, depending on what her job situation might be. I wanted to give her a chance to be sure to ask her question, and she may even have to leave in the middle of our time this morning. Kat, are you there? And the question is appropriate. We keep hearing about how many people have died because of this virus. And it just seemed your question of Dr. Cobb was especially relevant today. And John was prompted that you might be asking this.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I asked this question before all of this coronavirus started, just getting crazy like it is. But it was because my uncle was dying, and then he did die in February. And so here's my question. How does process thought explain death? I recently lost a close relative, and I'm trying to understand how death fits with process. It could be the death of a person, a pet, or a tree, but my question really came out of the loss of my relative. Why do we die? Where do we go when we die? Do the answers apply to all living things when they die?
John, are you there?
Okay, well, I'll take a few minutes to try to give a process understanding of death. And I think we need to begin by understanding that for process thought, the actual entity is momentary, and it perishes as soon as it becomes. So in one sense, death is everywhere, always. Wherever there is life, there is death. Even with inorganic, what we would think of as inorganic things, are made up of momentary events. So when we say death, we don't usually mean that perpetual perishing that is metaphysically universal and everywhere and all the time. We usually mean very often we mean the death of a human person. And a person in the process view is a succession of events, a succession of experiences that have a particular kind of unity. And Whitehead explains that in some detail. But we need to understand what an amazing achievement it is in the evolutionary process to have produced something that has the continuity of a person that grows from infancy, and even before infancy, of course, to being a mature human being, and then declines. This is, the wonder is that this has happened at all. It's one of the things that is not really explained without understanding that there is a deep commitment of the entire universe to produce not only actual entities, but actual entities of a very remarkable kind that can grow from moment to moment, including much of the past, but also adding to it. And that this has happened is the wonder of creation. Actually, if this kind of person were not able to die, a few people have tried to imagine what it would be like if one couldn't die. And it's not a pretty picture. The Wandering Jew, I believe, is a book about that kind of possibility. Life is very precious, but the value of life is not only in those moments of existence, but in giving oneself to something beyond. And the idea is that the only important thing to give ourselves to is a another member of the society that constitutes the person is very much a misunderstanding. So death doesn't mean, well, Whitehead objects to the faculty of simple location and the idea that when there are no more moments of experience connected with this body, the idea that I am completely finished, ended, nothing, is first not true, because my momentary existence has influenced things other than my own personal future. But it is also the case that the question of what happens to the, again, I don't want to make too many technical uses, but there is a presiding experience in human bodies almost all the time. And these presiding experiences may or may not end when the connection to the body ends. That is, I'm simply reporting Whitehead's view. He thinks that's an empirical matter, not a metaphysical one. For Descartes and Plato, life, the continuation of the soul is metaphysically known and required. And for many other people, philosophers, the metaphysics just doesn't have any place where any kind of continuity could possibly take place. So Whitehead is in between in saying, we don't know. I mean, it's not to be decided metaphysically. It's to be decided empirically. And I think that we've all become aware of a great deal of evidence, especially in near-death experiences, that point to the fact that the psyche can exist in some separation from the body. And so I think myself, I'm quite convinced that when my body dies, that's not my end, that the person continues. And I think that if I thought I would continue forever in this world, it would be a rather dreary prospect. But that a new adventure, a very different kind of experience, I can look forward to. My only personal, even close approximation to empirical was that I was with an uncle when he died. And his last words were, "Oh, it's so beautiful, so beautiful." What that means, you can, of course, it's all interpretation, but I interpret it to mean he was experiencing great beauty as he died. And I don't think the fact of the completion of the death would mean that that beauty would go away. So for people to die at an inappropriate time, I mean, for a young father or a young mother to die, children to have to grow up without their parents. I mean, there are many, many. Death can be an enemy, and we should do everything we can to prevent that kind of death. But to think that death after a full life is something evil that has to be explained in that sense, I think that's wrong. It's an enormous achievement. I'm very proud. It's not my achievement, but I'm very proud of the achievement of getting through 95 years and still being able to make some sense in relationship to other people. But I certainly don't dread the end. I've had lots of wonderful values, but a different adventure would be also something quite wonderful. And if we live out our full lives, we come to a point where so many of our closest connections have preceded us. So it's not a matter of being, I mean, it's being torn away from many very wonderful relationships, but it's a matter of renewing some wonderful relationships too. And I think when death comes this way, there's nothing to, it's simply to be celebrated that it's possible for us, a single person, to live so long and then to go on to something else. It's joyful rather than. Paul says, death has lost its sting. And I think the sting of death comes when people think, oh, they're going to be punished for all their sins. When we know that the ultimate reality with which we have to do is love, the idea that we will be punished in some extraneous way. We are punished by a lot of things. I mean, I have made mistakes. I have hurt people. I have done things that were deeply wrong, and there will never be a time when I don't receive some consequence of that, and that could be called punishment. But that's simply that when we do damaging things to ourselves and to other people, those are consequences that don't go away just because we're sorry about them. Sometimes we can heal them a little bit, but I don't want to say that our crimes are without consequence. They're with consequence for ourselves. That, if that's punishment, then punishment is built into the nature of life. But we are forgiven, and we are loved, and we are received with loving forgiveness. I would love to hear the phrase, "Thou good and faithful servant." That would be heaven for me. That's enough.
Let's, Kat, he'll give you the first chance to respond, and if anybody else has some comments you want to make, we'll spend just a little more time on this and then move on to Andrew's conversation. Kat, do you want to respond?
Yeah. So it really makes you realize how important every little thing that you do is, because every moment opens up the opportunity for other moments and what could happen in the future. So, and there's a story about somebody who said something that hurt somebody's feelings, and wanted to be forgiven and say, can I take the words back? And the person who was hurt took a pillow and ripped it apart and let the feathers go all over and said, when you can get capture every feather back, then you can take the words back. So, I mean, once it's out there, it's gone out. The repercussions, you can't take them back. So people can be forgiven, but so I think that it just makes our time here more important in what we do with our time, and not to waste our time, to make sure that the legacy that we leave is a good one.
Thank you. Does anybody else have some response you want to make?
I think Ignacio has a hand
Yeah.
raised, a virtual hand raised.
Okay. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. Well, a couple of PSs to the wonderful statement that John made. One is that, of course, David Griffin is probably the one who has written a little bit more about what the meaning of soul in process thought is, which is very different from the way in which most people use the term soul. So I think that's worth looking into. The other one is, of course, the poetic way in which we can talk about about life and death. And I'm now convinced that part of the reason why Whitehead calls God the poet of the world, of the poet of the universe, is that Whitehead, had been so influenced by Wordsworth that he saw in poetry kind of a summit that human beings can reach. And Whitehead's daughter said that he read the Prelude more than the Bible, especially in his latter years. So as we are cooped up, I commend all of you to read the Prelude. It's available free online. It's extremely long, but it can be read one book at a time or even half a book at a time. If you don't want to tackle that one, then I urge you to look, especially in view of our conversation right now, I urge you to look at the Ode on Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Childhood, also by Wordsworth. And that to me is it's a lot shorter than the Prelude, and it's a great source of comfort. As a pastor, I many times have used a short part of that long poem that seems to be quite comforting to the people who hear it. And so I'll just give you those lines. Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathies which, having been, must ever be, in the human thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. So, especially that line about the moments that having been must ever be, you will recognize process thought right there. And of course, Whitehead fleshed that out much more carefully into objective immortality and other ways.
Thank you. I think I'll wrap up this part of the conversation for now. Thank you, John, for responding, and thank you, Kat, for your good question. I want to make sure that we give plenty of time to Andrew, who has agreed to join us to talk about the event that he had the privilege of moderating a panel last Friday. Andrew, can